Welcome back, students. In this video, last video for this week, I'm going to talk briefly about the history of Southeast Asia in the 20th century, which is mainly influenced by World War II and the fallout of World War II. And World War II in the history of Southeast Asia is characterized by the Japanese invasion of the region that began after the collapse of France in 1940. On the same day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also invaded Thailand and forced Thailand to accept a peace treaty. As this map shows you, with the areas in dark brown, by 1942, the Japanese had seized much of Southeast Asia: Burma, Cambodia, Malaya, and the Philippines. Once the Japanese had been defeated in 1945, however, decolonization and nationalism re-emerged across the region. And so, again, as we saw in India, along with the development of European rule comes the adoption of European ideas. One of those European ideas in the 19th century, which is when colonization is taking place, is this idea of nationalism. And so in the 20th century, like we see elsewhere, there's a development of the nationalist movements in these regions, that there should be a Vietnamese nation. The Philippines should govern themselves. And so we see an acceptance of this logic by the European colonial powers. Partly also in the context of the Cold War, a recognition that if they do not grant independence to these nationalist movements, they're going to see communist revolutions occur in these countries. And the influence of communism and allies of the Soviet Union, against whom the United States and its Western allies are aligned, is going to increase across the world. And so we see, first of all, the United States granting independence to the Philippines in 1946, Indonesia fighting a bitter war, but eventually driving out the Dutch, and Burma securing its independence from Britain in 1948. Malaya and Singapore became independent of Britain in 1960. After a crisis called the Malayan Emergency. This was a period of communist insurrection in Malaya, which was overthrown through a period of guerrilla warfare against these communist forces. And the guerrillas, who are backed by the British, are successful in overthrowing the attempted communist government of Malaysia, and in return, Malaysians receive their independence. The Vietnamese achieved their independence by driving out the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This is one of your key terms for this week. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu is significant because it is a catastrophic defeat of the French army by Vietnamese nationalists, where by the end, conditions for the French army were really appalling. And it's significant because it shows now that Asian nationalist armies were able to defeat European armies and defeat them with great success. After the Vietnamese achieve independence, Vietnam is divided into North and South Vietnam under the guidance of the United Nations. And conflict emerges. This is as part of the story of the history of Southeast Asia that you're probably familiar with. Conflict emerges between North Vietnam, backed by communist China, and South Vietnam, which retains greater ties to Western European culture and way of life. Despite American involvement, in the end, North Vietnam conquers Southern Vietnam, and you can see South Vietnamese here desperately trying to escape from communist rule from the American embassy as the capital of Vietnam is falling. And communist governments were also established in Laos and Cambodia. These led to the truly horrific Cambodian genocide, in which a quarter of the Cambodian population died as part of an effort to turn Cambodia into a fully agrarian society in order to provide food for communist China. All direct European rule in Southeast Asia ended in 1984, when the British finally left their last territory in Brunei That's pretty recent when you think about it. Less than 40 years ago, there was still European rule of Southeast Asia. Today, we have seen significant economic growth across Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are all important centers of manufacture. A lot of goods that are imported into the Western world are manufactured in these countries. It's made these countries relatively successful. Singapore has become one of the most influential, wealthiest cities in the world as a result of its banking industry. And other areas of Asia, particularly the former communist countries, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, remain less developed, but economists generally consider that these countries also have the resources to become economically successful in the same way that Southeast Asia has. I hope you've enjoyed this week's material, and I'll see you next week when we talk about the history of Japan.